Thanos. Tony Stark said 3 words, snapped his fingers, and erased the villain who'd already won. And this death works because it follows a principle that appears in almost every satisfying conclusion. The antagonist has to lose using the exact tool they believed made them invincible. To understand why Thanos dying in Endgame hit so differently, you have to look at what Marvel had been building across 11 years and 22 films. The entire Infinity Saga was structured around a single question: what happens when the villain actually wins? And Infinity War answered it by letting Thanos succeed completely. Half of all life in the universe was gone. Spider-Man had crumbled to dust in Iron Man's arms, and the Avengers were left standing in the wreckage of Wakanda, completely shell-shocked, while the bad guy watched the sunrise in complete satisfaction. Behind the scenes, the Russo brothers made a deliberate storytelling decision by ending Infinity War without hope, because they understood something about audience psychology. Satisfaction requires deprivation first. The year between Infinity War and Endgame wasn't just a release schedule gap. It was designed to let audiences sit with loss long enough that the reversal would feel earned, rather than inevitable. Then Endgame gave us that reversal in the most psychologically precise way possible. The final battle was absolute chaos, with every hero who'd ever appeared in the MCU fighting on the same battlefield. But it all came down to one moment. Thanos had the Infinity Gauntlet. He raised his hand, and he announced that he was inevitable before snapping his fingers with complete confidence. And nothing happened, because Tony Stark had used his nanotech suit to steal the Infinity Stones during their struggle. And now, they were glowing on his own gauntlet instead. The man who'd started the MCU as a selfish billionaire was about to end it as the ultimate sacrifice. And his response echoed the line that launched the entire franchise when he said, "And I am Iron Man." What made Thanos disintegrating so satisfying follows a pattern that appears whenever storytelling reaches its highest form. The villain was destroyed by the exact mechanism he'd pioneered. The stones he'd gathered, the snap he'd perfected, and the inevitable victory he'd claimed were all turned back on him by a human in a metal suit. This reveals something about why poetic justice resonates so deeply with audiences. We don't just want villains to lose. We want them to lose in ways that expose the flaw in their original logic. Thanos watched himself crumbling with the same horror his victims had felt. Then he sat down in the dirt, accepted his fate, and faded to nothing without any defiance or final threats. Just a tyrant realizing he'd lost to the people he'd dismissed as insignificant. Tony Stark died seconds later because the snap was too much for a human body to survive. But he died having beaten the unbeatable and having made Thanos watch himself lose. In leadership terms, this is the difference between power and sacrifice. Thanos accumulated power believing it made him invincible, while Tony demonstrated that true strength comes from being willing to give everything up. The theater reactions tell you everything you need to know. People cheered, people cried, and some did both at the same time, because after 11 years of careful narrative construction, Marvel had delivered a villain death that felt both inevitable and earned. Green Goblin. Norman Osborn killed Gwen Stacy, and then his own glider impaled him through the chest, and for over 20 years, nobody brought him back. Which reveals how permanent death used to function as a storytelling tool before the resurrection economy took over comics. Amazing Spider-Man number 122 was published in 1973, and to understand why this death matters, you have to understand what writer Jerry Conway was trying to accomplish at just 20 years old. Conway had inherited Spider-Man from Stan Lee and wanted to establish that his version of the book would have real consequences, so he made a decision that shocked the entire industry. He killed Peter Parker's girlfriend in a way that might have been Peter's own fault. Gwen Stacy was dead after Peter tried to save her with a web line, but the sudden stop snapped her neck. The comic even included a small snap sound effect near her neck, which remains controversial to this day because it implied Peter's rescue attempt was what killed her. Whether the fall would have been fatal anyway, or the save itself was the cause, Gwen was gone. And the Green Goblin was standing there cackling about it and promising Spider-Man would be joining her soon. That's when Spider-Man completely snapped and beat Norman Osborn nearly to death with his bare hands, coming closer to killing than he'd ever been and closer than he ever wanted to admit. But at the last moment, looking at the bloody wreck he'd made of Osborn's face, Peter stopped himself because he refused to become a murderer, even for Gwen. This is where the death becomes psychologically perfect. Norman saw that hesitation and mistook it for weakness. So he remotely activated his glider and positioned it behind Spider-Man for one final kill shot. The blades would impale the wall crawler from behind while he stood there being noble, giving Norman one last laugh. But Spider-Man's spider sense saved him at the last second, and when he dodged, the glider didn't stop. Norman Osborn died pinned to a wall by his own weapon, killed by the very murder attempt he'd launched against his nemesis. This follows a pattern in satisfying villain deaths, where the antagonist is destroyed by their inability to stop being who they are. Norman couldn't accept that Spider-Man had shown mercy, and he couldn't resist going for one more kill, and that compulsion was exactly what ended him. The Green Goblin died because he couldn't stop trying to kill Spider-Man even after Spider-Man had spared his life. Behind the scenes, editor Roy Thomas made a decision that would define how Marvel treated major deaths for the next 2 decades. He kept Norman dead, while other villains came back within issues. Osborn stayed in the ground for over 20 years, while his legacy haunted Spider-Man comics, through Harry becoming the next Goblin and various imitators following the pattern. When Norman finally returned during the Clone Saga in 1996, it revealed something about how the comics industry had changed. The resurrection wasn't driven by story necessity. It was driven by the recognition that villains were intellectual property assets that couldn't be left dormant forever. But the original death still works, because it was never really about Norman getting what he deserved. It was about Norman getting exactly what he gave, delivered by his own hand through his own weapon. Joker. Batman finally broke the Joker's neck in 1986, and then the Joker broke it the rest of the way himself, just to frame Batman for murder. And this death works because it represents the only logical conclusion to their dynamic. Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns was published during a specific moment in comics history when the industry was trying to prove that superhero stories could be serious literature. Miller reimagined both characters as aging warriors locked in a decades-long dance of destruction. And this wasn't your Saturday morning cartoon Joker. This version had murdered over 600 people, including Jason Todd, and he'd spent years in a catatonic state at Arkham Asylum, completely unresponsive to any treatment or stimulus, until the moment the news reported that Batman had come out of retirement. Then the Joker woke up smiling, which reveals something about how Miller understood the psychological dependency at the core of their relationship. Their final confrontation happened in a carnival tunnel of love, because Miller was never one for subtlety, but the violence that followed was absolutely real. The Joker had already killed 16 children with poisoned cotton candy and murdered an entire television studio audience with Joker venom. And now, he was casually shooting civilians during their fight just to use them as distractions. Batman had spent decades fantasizing about killing this man, and the narration makes that explicit by showing us how he'd imagined torturing the Joker for weeks before finally ending him. But he'd never acted on those fantasies because he'd always stopped himself, and that restraint was what made him Batman instead of just another killer. This time, he almost didn't stop, and he twisted the Joker's neck hard enough to paralyze him from the waist down. But even after everything, after 600 deaths, after Jason, after all of it, Batman couldn't bring himself to finish the job and cross that final line. So the Joker laughed at him, called him weak, and then with his last ounce of strength, twisted his own head the rest of the way around and killed himself while Batman watched. This death follows a pattern where the most satisfying conclusions aren't about heroes winning. They're about the conflict reaching its only possible resolution. Batman couldn't kill because that would destroy who he was, and the Joker would rather die than let Batman win. So the Joker got his final joke while Batman got his worst nightmare, and nobody really achieved satisfaction. That's exactly why it's perfect, because it reveals that some conflicts can't be won by either side. Behind the scenes, the original art pages from this scene sold at auction for $550,000, making them the most expensive story pages from the entire series. Collectors and fans recognized the moment as definitive because Miller had found a way to end the Batman/Joker conflict that honored both characters' psychology completely. The death revealed that the Joker's ultimate goal was never to kill Batman. It was to corrupt him or to die, proving Batman couldn't be corrupted. He achieved the latter. Thanos. Carnage. The Sentry flew Carnage into space and ripped him in half without any negotiation or mercy, leaving 2 pieces of serial killer floating in orbit. And readers loved it because it represented something comics rarely deliver: the application of overwhelming force to a problem that politics had kept alive for too long. To understand why this death felt so cathartic, you have to understand the editorial strategy that had kept Carnage alive for over a decade. Cletus Cassidy debuted in 1992 and immediately became one of Marvel's most marketable villains, too popular to permanently kill, too useful as a recurring threat, and too merchandise-friendly to take off the board. Every time heroes captured him, he escaped, and every time they thought they'd stopped him, he came back even worse. Carnage had what industry insiders call plot armor, made of marketing decisions. Then, in 2004, Brian Michael Bendis put him in the same room as the Sentry. New Avengers #2 introduced Marvel's answer to Superman, and Bendis made a deliberate choice about how to establish this character's power level. The scene happened during a prison break at the Raft, a maximum security facility for superhuman criminals, and when Electro knocked out the power, every villain started escaping at once. Carnage was carving through anyone in his path, including Daredevil and the lawyers who'd come to visit, and it looked like another typical rampage, the kind that would end with Carnage captured and waiting for his next escape. But Matt Murdock's partner Foggy Nelson was trapped in a cell with the Sentry, a hero who'd voluntarily imprisoned himself because he feared his own power. This was a man with the strength of 1,000,000 exploding suns who was hiding in a prison cell because he was terrified of what he might do if he let himself loose. Foggy convinced him to act and be a hero instead of a prisoner, and what followed reveals something about why certain villain deaths satisfy audiences so completely. The Sentry emerged from his cell, grabbed Carnage, flew straight up through 8 floors of concrete and into the stratosphere until they reached the cold vacuum of space, and then tore Carnage apart with his bare hands without any dramatic confrontation or villain monologue or hero angst about crossing lines. This follows a pattern that appears in real-world crisis management. Sometimes the best solution to an impossible problem is simply applying enough force that the problem stops being impossible. Readers loved this death because it treated Carnage like what he actually was, which was a monster that needed to be put down, rather than a nemesis who deserved a dramatic final battle. Carnage eventually returned because the symbiote kept Cassidy alive in a coma until another villain recovered him. But the moment of his apparent death remains iconic because it revealed what happens when you remove editorial protection from an unkillable villain. Sometimes the answer to an impossible adversary is just finding someone strong enough to not care about the impossibility. Reverse Flash. Thomas Wayne ran a sword through Eobard Thawne's chest while the world burned around them. And this death remains satisfying because it follows a specific pattern. Villains who are too focused on tormenting their enemies often forget to watch for threats they've dismissed as irrelevant. The Flashpoint timeline was created when Barry Allen traveled back in time to save his mother from being murdered, and the resulting paradox broke everything. To understand what DC was doing with this story in 2011, you have to recognize that Flashpoint was designed to serve a specific editorial purpose. It would reset DC's entire continuity into the New 52, erasing decades of accumulated history. The story needed a scope large enough to justify that kind of universal restructuring. Bruce Wayne was dead in this timeline, killed in Crime Alley as a child, and his father Thomas had become Batman instead, but not the Batman anyone would recognize. This version was a brutal, gun-wielding vigilante who was completely willing to kill, while Martha Wayne had gone insane from grief and become that timeline's version of the Joker. The whole world was wrong with Aquaman and Wonder Woman at war, millions dying in the crossfire, and reality itself coming apart at the seams. The Reverse Flash was the only person who remembered the original timeline, and he was also completely immune to paradox because his connection to the Speed Force meant he existed outside normal time. He couldn't be erased from existence, which meant he could only be killed the old-fashioned way, and his immunity had made him arrogant. Thawne spent the entire Flashpoint event taunting Barry and explaining that Barry himself had caused this nightmare by saving his mother. The Reverse Flash hadn't created this hell. He was just enjoying watching Barry suffer through every death, every horror, and every twisted version of a beloved hero that existed because of Barry's selfish choice. The final battle came as Aquaman's doomsday weapon prepared to destroy the entire world, and Barry needed to run fast enough to reset the timeline. But Thawne kept interfering, beating Barry down and gloating that he'd rather die in this apocalypse than let Barry fix anything he'd broken. He was so focused on tormenting Barry that he completely forgot about Thomas Wayne standing behind him. This follows a pattern in both fiction and real-world crisis situations. People who believe they're invulnerable often develop blind spots around threats they consider beneath them. Thomas Wayne wasn't a speedster, wasn't connected to the Speed Force, and couldn't threaten Thawne in any of the ways that mattered to a time traveler. But Thomas was a Batman with no rules, and he had a gun. The shot was brutal and sudden because Thawne was mid-monologue about why Barry would never have enough Speed Force energy to save anything when his skull exploded. Thomas Wayne stood there with a smoking gun and no apology, no hesitation, and no speech about justice. Just a father who had eliminated a threat to his son's counterpart without a second thought. In the animated adaptation, the moment was even more stark because Thawne was mid-sentence when the bullet hit, and his arrogance killed him just as much as Thomas Wayne did. He'd been so confident in his own invincibility that he'd stopped paying attention to the most dangerous man in the room, and that overconfidence is what cost him everything. Kingpin. Frank Castle drove a hammer into Wilson Fisk's skull and then shot him twice in the back of the head while Fisk's own wife watched through the window. And this death works because it stripped away every layer of protection that had made the Kingpin feel invincible, revealing the truth that power is ultimately borrowed from the people who choose to support you. The Punisher Max series existed in Marvel's adults-only imprint, which meant no editorial restrictions and no continuity concerns. And this matters because it explains why this story could end the way it did. In the mainstream Marvel universe, the Kingpin was too valuable an asset to kill permanently. He appeared in Spider-Man comics, Daredevil comics, and had just been featured in the Affleck Daredevil film. But the Max imprint operated under different rules, and writer Jason Aaron understood that the most satisfying way to end the Punisher/Kingpin conflict was to answer a question the main universe would never address. What actually happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? The war between Wilson Fisk had been building for years across this series, and Fisk had tried everything to stop it. He'd sent hitmen, hired Bullseye and Elektra, and deployed small armies of enforcers, but nothing worked because the Punisher killed everyone Fisk sent and just kept coming. This wasn't the mainstream Marvel universe where heroes and villains dance around each other forever. This was a world where problems got solved permanently. So the Kingpin finally decided to handle it personally at his old family home, which was the same place where Frank's wife and children had been murdered years ago. Fisk brought a team of assassins and every advantage that money could buy, killed every single one of them anyway. Then the two men fought hand-to-hand while trading blows that should have killed either of them. Fisk was enormous, and trained, and powerful, because the Kingpin of crime hadn't gotten that title by being soft, was dying from wounds accumulated over a lifetime of war, with every bone broken at least once and every organ damaged. He was running on hate and nothing else, and he won by driving the claw end of a hammer into Fisk's temple and leaving it there. The Kingpin staggered home while brain-damaged and terrified, desperate to reach his own building before the Punisher could catch up to him. He actually made it to his door where his wife Vanessa was waiting inside, and he begged her to let him in and save his life. She kept the door locked. This is where the death becomes psychologically devastating. Vanessa had watched Fisk let their son die to further his criminal empire, and she'd watched him discard her when she became inconvenient. Now she watched through the window as the Punisher approached her husband from behind, and she didn't move a muscle to help him. 2 bullets to the back of the head ended Wilson Fisk. Final words to him were simple: "Your city, my world." This death follows a pattern that appears in stories about powerful men who confuse fear for loyalty. The Kingpin had spent his entire life believing that his money, his empire, and his reputation made him untouchable. But when the moment came, none of it could save him. His money couldn't stop a bullet. His empire couldn't protect him from a man with nothing to lose. And his own wife chose revenge over helping him survive. In the end, the Kingpin died like any other criminal the Punisher had executed, alone, afraid, and completely powerless, begging for his life outside his own front door while nobody let him in. The Max imprint answered the question that the main universe never could. The immovable object dies on his doorstep, and nobody mourns him.